Thomas Bogard, a man born into power, inherited cruelty like an heirloom. His laughter carried through the corridors at night, mocking his wife's dreams. He didn't believe in curses or bloodlines or the old warnings whispered in the quarters after dark. But his wife did, Elena, a woman educated, quiet, and haunted by something she could never explain. She had seen a figure in the fields, tall, motionless, and watching. And when she told Thomas, he laughed. He always laughed. Until the night their newborn looked up at him and spoke another man's name. Every time I've read those records, I've felt the same chill crawl down my spine. Because there are things that repeat themselves in history, not as coincidence, but as consequence. You can bury a secret beneath generations of soil, but you can't stop it from growing roots. The story of Willow Creek Plantation isn't just a ghost story. It's a mirror. And before we're done, you'll see yourself in it. Now listen closely, because the deeper we go, the harder it'll be to come back. You ever notice how every haunting begins the same way? Not with screams, not with blood, but with disbelief. Someone always laughs first. Someone always says, "It's nothing." That's how Thomas Bogard sealed his fate. It started in April of 1852. His wife, Elena, had been standing by the window, her reflection swallowed by twilight, when she saw him, for the first time, a man among the cotton, tall as the trees, still as a statue, watching. Not working, just there. No movement, no sound, only the feeling of being seen by something that remembered you. She told Thomas, and he laughed. That's the first act of every curse, mockery. The powerful laugh at what they fear to understand. They tell themselves control is protection, but control is the first illusion to die. You have to understand the world they lived in. A plantation was more than land and wealth. It was a psychological fortress, a kingdom built on obedience and denial. Everyone had a role, and breaking it invited ruin. The slaves knew it. The wife knew it. And Thomas, he believed himself untouchable, a god of dirt and coin. When he told her she'd imagined it, the air in that house changed. The servants said the rooms grew colder at night. The mirrors began to distort light. Even the dogs refused to sleep on the east side of the property. But Thomas dismissed it all as hysteria, a convenient word men used when women saw what they weren't supposed to. And yet, every few nights, the man returned, always in a different place, by the well, by the creek, near the family cemetery where 3 generations of Bogards slept with white marble stones. Always silent, always staring. Elena started keeping notes, dates, times, even sketches. I've seen the copies in the archives. Her handwriting becomes frantic toward the end, lines pressed deep into the paper like she was trying to carve the truth into time itself. Thomas never looked at her notes. He didn't want to, because deep down, he'd begun to feel it too. The watching, the judgment, the slow, invisible hand that always comes for those who think they own other souls. This was never about a ghost. This was about consequence made flesh. And you, yes, you listening now, should remember this. The past doesn't sleep. It waits. There's a difference between fear and knowing. Fear trembles in the dark. Knowing walks into it. By the time summer reached the Bogard plantation, Elena knew. She hadn't told Thomas yet, not about the pregnancy, not about the thing that was growing too quickly, too quietly inside her. Sarah, her attendant, noticed first. The body doesn't lie, even when the lips do. But what disturbed Sarah wasn't the pregnancy itself, it was the way Elena stared at empty corners, as if listening to something only she could hear. She told Sarah once, in a whisper too small for the room to hold, "It isn't growing inside me. I'm growing inside it." That's not the kind of sentence a woman says in 1852 and survives. But she wasn't mad, not yet. She was aware, lucid, terrified, because she felt the child moving before any doctor said she should. She said it wasn't kicking, it was searching. Every night, she locked her door, drew the curtains, and prayed under her breath in a language Sarah didn't recognize. Something older, something that didn't belong in Georgia or in any Christian household. You have to understand, back then, plantation wives were prisoners of their own silence. Their fear was ornamental, something they carried politely, the way they carried their parasols. But Elena had broken that decorum. She was listening to something her husband had spent his life denying. The hum beneath all systems of control. The sound of guilt trying to take form. Thomas, of course, believed himself a man of reason. He wrote in his journal that pregnancy had weakened her mind. He called it hysteria, like all men who can't comprehend consequence. But his entries began to shift, too. He wrote about hearing voices in the nursery at night, about the sound of someone breathing just beyond the walls, about his wife talking softly to something that answered. The Bogard plantation stood tall on its hill, but inside those white columns, reason had already begun to rot. And if you listen, truly listen to any old place long enough, you'll hear the same sound that she did. Not a voice, not even words, just remembering. Because what grows from the soil of cruelty never dies. It just changes shape until it finds a new vessel to be born through.
The house was built for silence. High ceilings, long corridors, walls thick enough to swallow a scream. During the day, it gleamed white, an emblem of order and discipline. At night, the shine turned gray, and every surface seemed to breathe. Thomas told himself it was the heat that warped the mirrors, the humidity that made the wallpaper peel in long, curling tongues. Yet sometimes, as he walked past the nursery door, the knob would turn by itself, just a tremor, as though the house wanted to remind him that he was not alone in his own domain. Elena began keeping the shutters closed. She said the sunlight hurt her eyes, but the truth was that reflections disturbed her. The mirror above her dressing table no longer showed her properly. Her face looked thinner, her mouth slightly delayed when she moved. Sarah tried to polish the glass until it was spotless, but the more she cleaned, the darker the reflection became, like water under moonlight. The master laughed when he noticed. "She's frightened of her own image," he said. But that night, he dreamed he saw someone else inside that mirror, a man whose eyes didn't blink, standing directly behind his wife's shoulder. By August, the household had fallen into a rhythm of whisper and denial. The servants moved carefully, avoiding certain rooms where the air pressed too heavy on the chest. The East Hall always smelled faintly of iron. At the dinner table, Elena no longer ate. She sat perfectly still, one hand resting on her swollen stomach, the other tracing invisible symbols on the tablecloth. Thomas would clear his throat, pretend not to notice, and talk about harvest yields, shipments, profits, numbers he could understand. Sometimes he caught her watching him with a kind of pity, as though she knew something he never would. Once, late at night, he woke to the sound of rocking, steady, patient, measured, and followed it to the nursery. The chair moved by itself, slow and deliberate, the rhythm of a lullaby that no human voice was singing. He stood there until dawn, his throat dry, waiting for logic to return. When it did not, he went back to bed and told himself it had been the wind. The next morning, Sarah found every mirror in the house turned toward the walls. She didn't ask who had done it. Some truths, especially in that house, were better left unnamed. When reason fails, People reach for ritual. Thomas began locking the nursery door at night, as though brass and wood could stop whatever moved through that house. He started sleeping in the guest room, his pistol beside him, telling himself it was for protection against thieves. Yet every time thunder rolled over the fields, he thought of footsteps on the staircase and the creak of that rocking chair that refused to stay still. Elena's condition worsened in ways no doctor's manual could describe. She didn't sleep. She drifted in and out of long, empty trances, her lips moving in patterns of words no one recognized. Once, Sarah pressed her ear close and thought she heard numbers, 7, then 3, then 9, repeated like a prayer. Another night she found her mistress kneeling by the window, whispering to the east field as if answering someone's call. When Sarah tried to help her back to bed, Elena smiled faintly and said, "He's closer than you think." The servants started refusing to enter the nursery altogether. Dishes left by the door were found moved in the morning, chairs shifted, sheets damp as though from a body that had lain there. Thomas forced himself to believe it was all hysteria. The human mind, he told himself, invents what it cannot control. But he couldn't explain the faint prints in the dust, too large for a child, too bare for a man who wore shoes. He began to drink more, his hands trembling even when the glass was full. In his journal, one of the few pieces left after the fire years later, he wrote a single line that survived the ash. "I no longer know whose breath fills this house." By late September, the plantation's cotton turned brittle. The workers said the soil was soured. The overseer left without a word. And at twilight, Sarah claimed to see something standing at the edge of the cemetery, where the ground sunk slightly from old graves. She swore it was the same tall figure from the field, motionless, patient, watching the windows. That night, Elena called Thomas to her bedside and said, "When the rain comes, you will see what you mocked." He didn't answer. He couldn't, because somewhere deep down, beneath the noise of his own disbelief, he already knew something was coming for its due. By dawn, the storm had moved east, leaving the plantation drenched and silent. A pale fog clung to the cotton rows, muffling the world in a strange hush. Inside the house, the lamps had burned out, their wicks blackened, and the scent of oil still hung in the air. Sarah found her mistress asleep at last, the child bundled against her chest. She dared not look at its face. Something about the stillness of its body, the deliberate, perfect quiet, made her step back. Thomas was nowhere to be seen until mid-morning. He was sitting on the veranda, his clothes damp, staring into the gray distance as if waiting for the sun to confess something. When Sarah brought him coffee, he didn't drink. He only asked, "Did it speak again?" She didn't answer. The truth had already written itself across his face. The household worked in silence that day. No one spoke of what had happened, yet every sound felt amplified. The creak of boards, the closing of doors, the faint sigh of the wind through the shutters. In the nursery, the cradle rocked softly on its own, the motion too steady to be accidental. Sarah stopped it, whispered a prayer, and left the room without looking back. That evening, Thomas gathered the servants in the main hall and gave instructions in a voice that barely rose above a whisper. "No one," he said, "will speak of what occurred last night. Not to anyone outside this house. Not ever." The words were not a threat, they were a plea. The men nodded, the women crossed themselves. When they dispersed, no one looked him in the eye. Elena remained in her room, pale and hollow, refusing food or conversation. Sometimes, from the corridor, Sarah heard her humming softly, the same melody that had rocked the cradle before the birth. Once, as Sarah passed the door, the humming stopped, replaced by a voice too deep to belong to a woman. She fled downstairs and told no one what she had heard. As the night returned, Thomas tried to write in his journal, but found the words slipping away. The ink smeared, the pages damp from his shaking hands. He wrote a single sentence before closing it forever. "It carries a memory older than mine." Outside, in the east field, the fog moved like breath, folding over the graves and the roots of the old trees. Something waited there, patient as time itself. crack in the glass ran from the crown of the frame to the edge of the desk, a single crooked vein dividing his reflection. Thomas stared at it for hours, waiting for reason to return. He blamed heat, pressure, anything measurable. But in his gut he knew it had split the same moment he heard the whisper. The break looked clean, surgical, as if someone had drawn a blade straight through his likeness. By late afternoon, he could no longer bear the quiet. He went to the stables, saddled his horse, and rode the perimeter of the property. The fields looked wrong, rows uneven, soil turned as though a hand had pressed upward from underneath. The graves in the family plot had sunk deeper. Water pooled in the indentations like eyes staring up. He dismounted at the east field, the place his wife had spoken of first. The earth there was blacker than the rest. The cotton plants shriveled into ash-colored stalks. In the distance, he thought he saw a man standing among them. When he blinked, there was nothing but mist. Back at the house, Elena sat on the veranda, the child in her arms, humming again. The sound followed him even after he passed her, carried through the hallway until he slammed his study door. He poured a drink, then another. Outside the light dimmed, but the mirror on the wall still held a glint of day. He turned it toward the wall, heart hammering. When he sat again, he heard the scrape of wood behind him, the frame slowly twisting back to face the room. That night he dreamed of the old well behind the willow trees, the one his father had sealed decades before. In the dream, water boiled inside it, though no fire burned beneath. A voice rose with the steam. Debt must be paid in likeness. He woke choking on the taste of iron, his hands damp with soil that shouldn't have been there. At breakfast, he tried to tell Elena he wanted to leave for Savannah, to take the child to a doctor, to find a church. She smiled faintly, the same smile she'd given the night she announced the pregnancy. "There's nowhere left to go," she said. "The door was never for us." When she stood, the baby's eyes opened, catching the morning light like two pieces of amber glass. Thomas looked away first. He always did. The following days passed without sequence. Thomas stopped marking dates in his ledger. Every sunrise felt the same, a pale disk swimming in fog. The workers began to vanish quietly. One gone at dawn, another by supper, until the fields stood empty. No one spoke of it. No one needed to. The silence of the earth said enough. Inside, Elena's strength ebbed. She moved with the grace of a sleepwalker, her hands cold even near the fire. The child never cried, never laughed. It watched. Sometimes Thomas would find it staring at the walls, pupils dilated as if tracking something invisible. When he reached for it, her wife turned her body protectively, eyes glassy and remote. "He knows you now," she would whisper. "That's enough." Thomas began to smell damp earth everywhere, in his clothes, in the bedding, even in his bourbon. He tore up floorboards looking for leaks, found none. At night, he heard dripping, slow and steady, as though the whole house were weeping from its foundations. He wrote again, brief notes that trembled with ink blots. If guilt had a sound, it would be this. Another page. Every mirror shows him older than yesterday. Then, simply, "I am becoming the echo." One evening, he returned from the stables to find all the windows open, though no one had touched them. The curtains breathed inward, heavy with the scent of rain and iron. Elena stood at the top of the staircase, the child in her arms, humming the same low melody that had followed him for months. "He's tired of the walls. He wants to walk the fields again." Thomas reached for the railing to steady himself. "Who?" Her voice softened. "The one you buried with your name still on his back." He took a step upward, but the air seemed to thicken between them. For the first time, he saw the marks on her wrists, small, perfect circles, as if a hand much larger than his own had gripped her too tightly. She turned away and disappeared into the nursery. The humming stopped. The house listened. Then from somewhere deep below the floorboards came the faint creak of the old rocking chair, slow and even, keeping time with a heart no one dared claim as their own. By the end of that week, the weather broke again. A warm wind rolled up from the south, heavy with the scent of rot, bending the magnolia trees until their blossoms fell like white ash. The change unsettled everything. Shutters banged though no breeze entered. Doors swelled in their frames. The clocks began to chime at the wrong hours. Thomas stopped winding them. The sound of the gears grinding inside the walls had started to feel too much like breathing. He tried to keep the household running. He sent riders to neighboring plantations, looking for workers, for witnesses, anyone who could remind him the world outside still moved by ordinary rules. No one returned. The roads washed out with the next rain. The bridges sank into the swollen creeks, and the estate became an island of its own decay. Elena rarely spoke now. When she did, her words were measured, almost gentle. "You don't listen," she told him one evening. "That's why you never heard the truth when it was still merciful." He asked what truth, but she only turned the child so its face pressed against her shoulder. "He dreams in the language of the soil. You wouldn't understand." That night, Thomas searched the house for Sarah, forgetting she had fled weeks before. He found her apron folded neatly in the kitchen, a single muddy footprint on the floor beside it. He followed the prints as far as the porch, but they stopped there. No trail, no direction, as though she had stepped off into air. Sleep became impossible. He wandered from room to room, candle in hand, talking to himself just to hear a voice that still belonged to the living. In the library, he heard whispering behind the shelves. When he pulled a book free, dust poured out in a slow gray sheet, and something inside the wall exhaled. He dropped the candle. Its flame caught the edge of a page, burning away words one letter at a time, until only a sentence remained. "We remember through you." He doused the ember with shaking hands, then went to the window. The east field shimmered in moonlight, the rows of dead cotton glowing faintly. For a heartbeat, he thought he saw movement there, a single figure pacing between the rows, pausing to look up at the house. He blinked, and the field was still. Only the wind moved, carrying the smell of rain and something older, something patient. He closed the curtains and whispered into the dark, "What do you want from me?" From upstairs, a child's voice answered softly, almost kind, "The truth."
Morning came without light. A low haze smothered the plantation, turning every surface to pewter. The air was so thick that even the birds had gone silent. Thomas stepped outside, barefoot, drawn by something he couldn't name. Dew soaked through his shirt. The fields stretched out before him, gray and endless. The cotton stalks were stripped bare now, nothing left but the husks. In the center of the east field, he saw the outline of the old well, stones half buried, the lid cracked from years of neglect. It was the place he'd seen in his dreams. He crossed the rows slowly, his heart matching the rhythm of his footsteps. The ground was soft, almost warm. When he reached the well, he felt a pulse beneath his boots, faint but alive, like the heartbeat of the land itself. The boards over the mouth were warped, the nails rusted through. He crouched, pressing his hand to the wood. The pulse grew stronger. Then he heard it, a soft sound, almost like breathing, rising from deep below. He tore away one plank, then another, until a rush of cold air poured up from the darkness. The smell was unmistakable, wet soil and something metallic, the scent that had haunted his dreams. He leaned closer, candle trembling, and saw his reflection in the water far below. It wasn't his own. The face staring back was older, darker,
its eyes the same amber color that burned in his son's. A sound carried over the field, his wife calling his name. He turned, but she was still on the veranda, the child in her arms. Her lips hadn't moved. Yet her voice, or something that used her voice, filled his ears again. "You remember what you did?" The wind rose suddenly, scattering dust into his eyes. When he looked back into the well, the water had turned black. It rippled once, and a shape began to form beneath the surface. 2 hands reaching upward, pale as bone. He stumbled backward, tripping over the boards. The heartbeat beneath the earth quickened, the rows of dead cotton trembling as if something vast was moving beneath them. He ran, all the way back to the house. But as he reached the porch, the door opened before he touched it. Elena stood there, calm, almost smiling. "It's awake now," she said, "and it remembers whose name it carried last." Behind her, from the nursery, came the soft sound of laughter, not a child's, not quite human, low, deliberate, and certain. When the storm passed, no one could say how long it had lasted. The clocks had stopped again. Even the sun looked altered, dull and coppery, hanging low over the horizon like an ember refusing to die. The air smelled of salt, though the sea was hundreds of miles away. Thomas stood on the veranda, drenched, his boots thick with mud. The field below shimmered as if water had filled the furrows. Eleonena was gone, the child too. He searched until nightfall. He moved through the cotton rows, calling their names until his voice rasped, his throat raw. He found the well newly sealed, the stones mortared tight though no hand had done it. When he touched them, they were warm. From somewhere beneath, faint music rose. The same tune Eleonena had hummed since spring, the one that had haunted his sleep. He pressed his ear against the stones, and the song seemed to breathe through him. Back inside, the house felt smaller. The hallways had warped, the ceilings lower. Dust drifted in slow spirals through the candlelight. He found his journal open on the desk, the last page written in his own hand, but not in his own words. A man builds a kingdom to hide his grave. He sat there until the ink dried, listening to the walls tick like cooling metal. For the first time, he thought of leaving, walking until the road found him, letting the house rot into the swamp. But when he opened the front door, the night pressed back, thick and impenetrable. Beyond the porch, the landscape was gone. No fields, no trees, no sound of insects. Only the faint reflection of his doorway repeating itself into darkness. He stepped forward and felt solid ground, yet each step echoed too long, as though he were walking inside a hollow. At dawn, the horizon returned. So did the sound of the rocking chair upstairs. He climbed the staircase slowly. The nursery door was ajar, the air cold enough to mist his breath. The cradle was still this time. In its place stood the mirror from his study, its crack healed, the surface flawless. And in the glass, he saw them, Eleonena, the child, and the figure from the field, standing behind him, waiting. He turned. The room was empty, but the reflection stayed, smiling faintly. When he looked down, the mirror showed his own hands, buried wrist-deep in dark soil. He didn't remember moving, didn't remember digging. The earth had simply found him.
By now, the house no longer kept its shape. Rooms shifted, doors opened into different halls than they had the night before. The few lamps that would still burn threw warped shadows, bending corners into places that should not exist. Thomas stopped fighting the disorientation. He moved where the corridors led him, talking softly under his breath just to prove he could still form words. He found himself drawn back to the study, to the desk where his father's old ledger lay. He turned the brittle pages, running his fingers over names and figures written decades ago. The handwriting grew darker toward the end, more frantic, as if his father had been writing faster than thought. Between two pages, Thomas found something pressed flat, a single child's footprint traced in ink. Beneath it, in faint script, "Willow Creek remembers its own." He shut the book, heart pounding. The walls seemed to creak in answer. He whispered, "What do you want me to see?" The air around him cooled, and the scent of damp cotton filled the room. The fireplace flared to life without spark, flames burning a dull blue. In them he saw the outline of his father's face, eyes hollow, mouth open in a silent laugh. The voice came low, almost kind. "You planted me in others. Now they bloom through you." Thomas stumbled backward, overturning the chair. He wanted to deny it, to claim ignorance, to call it madness, but the truth stood in front of him like a mirror that would no longer lie. Every cruelty, every silence, every lash and ledger entry had written the same story in different hands. He had only been its latest sentence. He climbed the stairs, dizzy with the weight of that realization. The nursery door was closed again. Behind it, the cradle creaked in slow rhythm. He opened the door and saw the child standing now, balanced on unsteady legs, staring straight at him. Its mouth moved soundlessly, then formed the word he dreaded most, "Father." He fell to his knees. "I'm sorry," he whispered. The child blinked, expression unreadable, and the mirror behind it caught the dawn, amber light flooding the room. For an instant he thought the reflection showed forgiveness. Then the glass darkened, ripples spreading across it like water disturbed by a stone. From somewhere far beneath that surface came a single reply. "Then remember."
When the light dimmed, he found himself alone again, the words still echoing in the hollow of his chest. "Remember." He whispered it back until it lost its shape, until it sounded like breathing. Outside, the day had broken fully, thin sunlight sliding through the cracks of the shutters. The ordinary sounds of the morning had returned, the buzz of insects, the groan of the porch settling, but everything carried the weight of repetition, as though the world had begun to loop. He dressed and walked the property slowly, his boots sinking into the mud where the rain had gathered. Every tree leaned toward the well. Every track, animal or human, curved in the same direction. At the edge of the east field, he stopped. The soil there was black and glossy, not with water, but with something thicker. He crouched, pressed his hand to it, and felt a faint vibration under his skin. The smell of iron returned. By noon, he had dug half the day away. The sun burned overhead, but the ground stayed cold. His shovel struck wood, then metal. He brushed the dirt aside until he uncovered a small box, its hinges rusted, its surface carved with initials he recognized, his father's and his own. He pried it open with trembling hands. Inside lay a collection of objects, a lock of hair tied with ribbon, a silver button, a scrap of paper stained dark. On the paper, written in his father's hand, was a single line: "When the child calls, follow." He left the box open in the field and walked back toward the house, the wind rising behind him. In the doorway stood Elena, or what remained of her. Her form shimmered in the heat, her outline shifting with each blink, like a memory half recalled. She held the child against her hip. "You found it! Now you can come home!" Thomas stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Where is home?" he asked. Her smile was soft, the kind that forgives and condemns in the same breath. Where it began. The wind caught her hair and scattered it across her face. For an instant he thought he saw the figure from the field standing inside her shadow, taller, watching. The ground beneath the steps trembled once. Somewhere below the earth, water began to rise. He looked down at his hands, at the streaks of dark soil marking his skin, and understood that the field had not released him. It had only been waiting for him to remember his place in the story.
By the time night came again, the house had fallen silent in a way that felt final. The insects outside had ceased their song, and the wind no longer moved the trees. Thomas sat on the veranda, staring at the well, the box still open in the field like a wound. The ribbon fluttered in the faint breeze, whispering against the grass. He knew he should close it, bury it, end it, but his body refused to move. Inside, the floorboards creaked softly. He thought at first it was Elena walking, but the steps were too small, too measured. He turned and saw the child at the end of the hallway, barely more than a silhouette. It didn't run or cry. It simply watched him, its head tilted slightly to one side. In the weak light from the doorway, its eyes caught the reflection of the moon, glowing faintly amber. Thomas rose slowly. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice breaking. The child raised its hand and pointed toward the east field. Then, in a voice too clear for its size, it said, "Follow." The word struck something deep inside him, a memory or an order, he couldn't tell which. He stepped off the porch, feet sinking into the damp earth, and began walking.
The air grew colder the closer he came to the well. Behind him, he heard the soft patter of bare feet keeping pace. When he reached the broken stones, he stopped. The boards he'd torn away were gone. The mouth of the well yawned open, black and endless. He looked back toward the house. Ilelena stood on the veranda again, but her outline had thinned into shadow, her dress rippling, though there was no wind. The child stepped to the edge of the well. Thomas felt panic rise in his throat. "No," he whispered, "not you." But the child turned and smiled, calm, almost compassionate. "It's not me, it's you." The ground shuddered, the air filled with the sound of rushing water. He fell to his knees, clutching the stones, as a column of black liquid rose from the well, spinning in slow circles. Faces shimmered within it, workers he'd known, names he'd written, debts he'd ignored. One by one they looked at him with eyes that were not accusing, but expectant. Ilelena's voice came faintly through the roar. "He called you by name long before the child was born." And then the water stopped moving. It hung in the air, motionless, a perfect mirror. In its reflection, Thomas saw not the house, not the field, only himself, standing where his father once had, ledger in hand, deciding who would live and who would vanish beneath the soil. He looked up at the sky, but there were no stars left, only the color of the earth reflected above, waiting to close. At the end, there was no sound left in the world but the wind moving through the grass. The house stood empty, its windows dark, the great veranda sinking into the soil that had fed it for generations. People in the nearby towns told stories of lights over the east field, of laughter at midnight, of a voice calling names that no one had carried for 100 years. They said the well had swallowed everything, the master, the wife, the child, the land itself. They said the cotton never grew there again. But the truth isn't in the rumors. The truth is what the soil remembers. Every empire, every fortune, every family that builds on the backs of others leaves a residue, a rhythm that waits. The Bogards called it Willow Creek, but the ground called it something older. It waits still, patient and unhurried, turning the weight of guilt into seed. In time, someone will build again on that hill, thinking the past has gone quiet, and the first time they hear the creak of a rocking chair, they'll know better. Because this was never a ghost story. It was an account. The field, the well, the walls, each keeps its own record, one that ink can't erase. Men like Thomas thought they could own land, people, destiny. What they never understood was that the land owns them. It remembers every promise broken, every name written twice in the same hand. It teaches by repetition. It buries nothing forever. If you've listened this far, you know why you found this story. History isn't past. It's the mirror you pass each morning, the ledger still open, the quiet breath you hear when you're certain you're alone. Every generation gets its own Willow Creek, its own chance to decide whether to keep pretending or to listen. So listen. Hear the hum under the surface of your own life, the part that asks what you're building on, who carries the weight, and whose name you're writing without realizing it. And when you hear it, don't turn away. Just whisper the words that end every story like this: I remember.